Welcome and thanks for joining today's presentation on working with local communities to preserve historic battlefields. My name is Brian Fainer and I'm with the National Park Service and help support our Connected Conservation effort. The Connected Conservation webinar series focuses on how NPS staff and partners can use various tools and strategies to conserve natural, cultural, and recreation resources at the landscape level. Working with gateway communities outside parks is critical to landscape scale conservation. And as such, our webinar series is exploring the numerous opportunities to partner with communities to further conservation. You can register for future webinars in our series and view past recordings by going to the Network for Landscape Conservation website and our internal National Park Service Connected Conservation Toolkit. Links to both of these websites will soon be in the chat box. Throughout the presentation, feel free to plug in questions into the questions box. We'll look at everyone's questions following the presentation. We will post a recording of today's webinar following the presentation. And as a reminder, our webinar series is open to federal and state agencies, nonprofits, and other conservation partners. So feel free to invite your colleagues to future webinars. We have three presenters with us today. Adam Gillenwater joined the American Battlefield Trust in 2015 and currently serves on the Trust's Government and Public Relations team as the Senior Manager for State and Local Relations. In that capacity, Adam focuses on cultivating and enhancing relationships with key partners, including government agencies and officials, representatives of allied organizations, and grassroots leaders on behalf of the Trust to support the battlefield preservation in communities and state capitals across the country. As Deputy Director of Government Relations for the American Battlefield Trust, Mark Coombs helps guide and oversee the Trust's Government and Public Affairs team and supports the advancement of the department's goals, with an emphasis on nourishing and growing bipartisan support for historic battlefield preservation and preservation-related funding and pursuits at all levels. Mark joined the staff in 2010. Mark Coussan serves as the American Battlefield Trust Senior Manager of Federal Relations, a position he has held since 2015. In that role, Paul leads the Trust's federal relations efforts, securing record appropriations for the American Battlefield Acquisition Grant Program and steering legislation through Congress to expand boundaries of several national parks and authorize the Battlefield Land Grant Program. Before we get started, I've also asked Christine Arado, who leads the National Park Service's American Battlefield Protection Program, to say a few words.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you all for inviting me to join and listen in on this presentation. Sorry, the echo chamber noise, just trying to minimize the background noise. I know that Paul, Adam, and Mark are going to tell you about the rich history of the American Battlefield Trust. And for nearly 30 years, they've really been leaders in the battlefield preservation field. It's been a growing cohort of nonprofit organizations partnering with communities and the federal government to preserve these important resources. And ABT has been responsive to not only the battlefield preservation needs throughout the country, but adapted in working with community and partner resources. I think they're going to talk a little bit about their shift, particularly in thinking about how we prepare for our national semi-quincentennial. But they've been a partner, a consistent partner and advocate for battlefield preservation. ABPP has been very delighted to work with them, especially over the course of the past 6 to 7 years. The ABPP has awarded more than 100 battlefield land acquisition grants to ABT and their state and local partners. I think that's an ample demonstration of their local community approach to preserving historic battlefields. And with that, I want to turn it over to our partners and battlefield preservationists, and delight to listen in. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Christine, for those remarks, and Brian, thank you for those warm introductions and for inviting us to present today. For folks on the line, I'm Adam Gillenwater with the American Battlefield Trust, and I'll get us started here. Let's see. Make sure we don't have any technical difficulties. Here we go. So jumping right into it, because we have a lot of content that we want to share with you all today. We'll give a brief introduction to the American Battlefield Trust, who we are, how we came to be, and why we see the work of preserving battlefields as urgent and important. We'll then walk you through sort of the broad brush strokes of our land preservation process here at the Trust, transition to some case studies focusing on our work in three battlefield communities, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Orange County, Virginia, and Franklin, Tennessee, and really close with sort of a deeper dive into some of the benefits of battlefield preservation to local communities, specifically as it pertains to heritage tourism, environmental benefits, and health and recreation, and then take any questions y'all might have. So I just want to sort of begin with a little bit of background on the American Battlefield Trust for folks on the line who might not be familiar with who we are. We're the nation's largest nonprofit battlefield preservation organization. We have about 50,000 members across the country and internationally. And as Christine was saying, the Trust has been around in one form or another for over 30 years at this point. Some of you on the call might know us from years past as the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites, or the Civil War Preservation Trust, or most recently the Civil War Trust. But in 2018, a couple years ago, we rebranded as the American Battlefield Trust because the name Civil War Trust didn't fully capture at that point the scope of our battlefield preservation efforts anymore. At that point, we'd been involved for several years in the preservation of Revolutionary War and War of 1812 battlefields as well. So we needed a new name to reflect that expanded mission. We've helped preserve, whether through fee simple acquisition or conservation easement, more than 52,000 acres at more than 130 battlefields in 24 different states. The vast majority of that is at Civil War battlefields and will continue to be, but certainly our expansion into the Revolutionary War in particular has expanded the number of states that we work in. And also, like, we're totally focused on three things: land preservation being foremost among them, so that we're preserving the places where history happened. Education, so we can educate the public about these defining wars in our national story and why they remain relevant today. And advocacy, so advocating both for the funding that makes battlefield preservation possible, as well as for or against policies or proposals that have the potential to impact battlefield integrity. And I do want to talk briefly off the top about the birth of the modern battlefield preservation movement, and really, how our organization came to be. In the 150 years that have passed since the Civil War and the nearly 250 since the American Revolution, obviously our country has grown and developed and expanded. And what we were seeing is battlefields across the country, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, were being lost under increasing development pressures. And one of the major challenges of battlefield preservation is that we're still connected in a lot of cases by the same roads and waterways that connected Civil War America. And increasing populations in the 150 years since have spurred development along those same strategic corridors. So what you see on the screen there is actually a map of the Chantilly battlefield from earlier in the 20th century, in the first half of the 20th century. And as you can see, at that point, a lot of it still remained in wooded cover or as farmland. But Chantilly and the loss of the Chantilly battlefield is an example of what helped to really light the fire for the modern battlefield preservation movement. So this was a September 1862 a battle where you had about 2,100 casualties, a couple of Union generals who were killed. And in the 1970s and 1980s, Fairfax County was experiencing explosive growth, much the same way it is today. And a lot of the battlefield was paved over for housing development. And I'll see if this works here. This map gives you a better sense of what the battlefield looks like today. The little plot you can see in brown there is about 5 acres that some determined preservationists were able to save as a county park. And that loss of, essentially all but 5 acres of the Chantilly battlefield helped to convince folks that something had to be done, on a national scale to help prevent this from happening in the future. And really, that's just one example. The Chantilly story isn't necessarily unique in that regard, unfortunately. But today's American Battlefield Trust, we're the result of that modern resurgence of interest in preserving hallowed ground, spurred on by the loss and threatened status of a lot of these battlefields from the second half of the 20th century. And building off of that, one of the reasons we think that this work continues to be so urgent and important is that battlefield land is still being lost at a alarming rate today. Nearly 20% of the sites identified in the Civil War Sites Advisory Commission report, which is something Paul's going to talk about here momentarily, have already been lost. And really that figure is from several years ago, so the percentage is likely higher today. And that's because battlefields remain, under tremendous pressure from development, both residential and commercial, for the reasons, we just talked about with regards to Chantilly. There's one estimate is that approximately 30 acres of battlefield land on average is lost every day. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague Paul to talk a little bit about our land preservation process and how the trust works to preserve some of these places.
Thanks, Adam. Again, this is Paul Coussan, the Senior Manager of Federal Relations at the American Battlefield Trust. And I'll just dive right in how we go about actually preserving our land. And we'll get too into the weeds, but just kind of an overview of how we work, how we operate, and how the land, this historic land, is preserved through our efforts and through our partners' efforts. As Adam mentioned, our guide is the Civil War Sites Advisory Commission report on the nation's Civil War battlefields and the follow-up report to Congress on the historic preservation of Revolutionary War and War of 1812 sites in the United States. These came from those early fights in the late 80s and early 90s when it was determined we need a guidebook. We need to know what battlefields are out there, what can still be preserved, and how to go about doing that. The first book, the Civil War Sites Advisory Commission report, was released in the early 90s. It was compiled by leading historians, experts, preservationists, and identified the 384 top priority Civil War battlefields. These were the battlefields where the outcome of the war was essentially determined. There were about 10,000 plus skirmishes during the Civil War. This identified essentially the cream of the crop in terms of battlefields that could be preserved, where there were preservation opportunities, and ranked them according to priority and preservation opportunities. In the mid-2000s, Congress authorized and the Park Service put together a similar book identifying the 243 priority Revolutionary War and War of 1812 battlefields. And so when the then Civil War Trust expanded its mission to include Revolutionary War and War of 1812 sites, that became the guide that we used as well. The book identifies core and study areas that essentially lay out where the heaviest fighting took place, where troops moved, and that is the basis on which we build our preservation guidelines and priorities. And in turn, we consult with historians, National Park Service, state and local historic preservation offices, and partners so that we know this is historic land that we're working on, that we're targeting to preserve. Next slide, please. So one of the first things we do or have done since these reports were released is map the lands based on the core and study areas outlined by the American Battlefield Protection Program. You can see on the map on the left, the pink circle, that's the core area, and kind of the tan area outside is the study. The core is essentially where the heaviest fighting took place, and the study areas identify where troops moved in and out, were camped, or hospitals were. Our focus is primarily on where the fighting took place. And then we identify the different parcels that are within that core and study area, and those become the target properties that we want to preserve either through acquisition or through conservation easements. If you see the map on the right, this is one of the battle maps that we put together. Again, using historians, researchers, we've been able to identify where troops moved, where the fighting took place on key parcels, and that helps us to build the case as to why this is a historic site, why this should be preserved. Next slide, please. So how we preserve the land. The first thing we do is once the maps are there, we get to know the landowners who own the land within the core and study areas. We developed and build relationships not only with the landowners but with the local community. We only work with willing sellers, and I want to stress that point because we do not use eminent domain. There's no federal, state, or local taking of land. We only work with folks who are willing to sell their land. We share with them that this is indeed historic property, that significant Civil War, Revolutionary War, War of 1812 battles took place there, and build that relationship so one day when they are ready to sell, that we are the first people that they think of, the first organization that they think of when they're looking to part ways with their land. Or if they're not ready to sell it, one thing we do is place a conservation easement on it, which of course allows the owner to continue using it, but with restrictions, keeping it essentially pristine and undeveloped. A lot of times we buy the land outright. Other times we purchase it, lease it back to either the owner or farmer so that it's maintained. Sometimes we purchase it and the owner will remain on the property under a life estate. But our goal is to make sure that that land is preserved in perpetuity. Next slide, please. Next thing, of course, is figuring out how to pay for it. The American Battlefield Trust is a nonprofit. We're a membership organization, and a lot of our supporters are often eager and willing to contribute their money to preserve the land, either through purchase or through easement. We also depend heavily on grants, either at the federal level, the state level, or through foundations. We also work very closely with partner organizations and with state or local governments on landowner tax benefits, which are beneficial to landowner and to preserving the actual land. Next slide, please. And then we determine what we're going to actually do with this land now that it's been preserved, especially the land that we've bought outright. We don't, as an organization, our goal is not to maintain the land, to own it forever. We want to get it in the hands of organizations or state or local governments, or in some cases, the National Park Service, who can continue to maintain, interpret, preserve these lands far better and far longer than an organization like the Trust could. Next slide, please. And finally, one thing we often do when we acquire the land or even get an easement on it is find a way to interpret it and turn it into what we intend, an outdoor classroom where folks can come, visit, understand what happened there, why it's important to American history. So we've worked with a lot of different education organizations. Also, we have internal historians who will work on setting up interpretation, trails, and removing structures that weren't present at the time of the battle. We also work to restore the land either through cutting down trees or grading the property, or, like I said, demolition of structures, houses, things that weren't there at the time of the battle. Our goal is to make it as close to an authentic battlefield experience as possible. Next slide, please. The work that we do could not be done without our partnership with the National Park Service, and in particular the American Battlefield Protection Program. ABPP administers the key federal grant program that the Trust and its partners depends on, the Battlefield Land Acquisition Grants Program. This is a one-to-one matching grant program that's been utilized by the Trust and its partners around the country to save more than 32,000 acres of endangered battlefield land. The program is currently authorized at or it has been authorized at $10 million and has been fully funded at that level for the past several years. Next slide, please. In addition to the land grant program, the American Battlefield Protection Program administers planning grants that assist local partners with planning and the management of battlefield sites. There were also 2 new grant programs that were just created in last year's reauthorization of the American Battlefield Preservation Protection Program, that created a restoration grant program and an interpretation grant program. Again, matching grant programs that partners like the trust, state and local entities, and nonprofits will be able to utilize to restore and interpret these sites so that they are outdoor classrooms. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague Mark Coombs, who will discuss some of the projects that the trust has worked on over the years in local communities.
Well, thanks, Paul. This is Adam. I'm actually going to steal it for a minute before passing it to Mark. One of the first things we want to do is to walk you through a couple case studies that highlight our work, specifically in a couple battlefield communities, and our work in partnership with those communities. The first one we want to highlight is certainly one we expect that everybody is familiar with to some extent, if not intimately familiar with, and that's the Gettysburg battlefield in Adams County, Pennsylvania. Preservation at Gettysburg actually really began almost immediately after the guns fell silent in July of 1863. For a little bit of history, the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association was created by the state legislature actually the following year in 1864, and in the years that followed, they appropriated dollars for preservation purposes. Near the close of the 19th century, in the 1890s, Congress established the Gettysburg National Military Park Commission, and a couple years later, the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, it turned over roughly 600 acres to the federal government as the start of the park up there. By the time the National Park Service assumed control of Gettysburg National Military Park in the early 1930s, land holdings at Gettysburg at the park had increased to more than 2,500 acres. Today, the National Park Service boundary at Gettysburg encompasses approximately 6,000 acres or so. And what you see on the screen here is essentially the state of preservation in Gettysburg today, or within the last couple of years, with the Gettysburg National Military Park seen there in sort of the blue highlight. The other preserved areas shaded in light green, and properties preserved by the trust, again, often in partnership with the National Park Service or the American Battlefield Protection Program, or our state and local partners in yellow and orange. I think it's important to note that while Gettysburg was really an early benefactor of some early preservation efforts, as the town grew and expanded in the years following the battle, development also certainly spilled out into the town and the surrounding townships. For example, in the 1940s, you had a construction which was started on a housing development directly in front of the Eternal Peace Light Memorial, which this construction has since been removed. You had the Mission 66, visitor center that was built in Ziegler's Grove, or the observation tower, which was built in the 1970s, all of which have been removed, as well as just, commercial development in and around the battlefield to support the town. And so today you have arguably what's our country's most prominent and recognizable battlefield, which is intertwined with the modern community that lives in it. And that Gettysburg community is both, reliant on the battlefield as an economic engine for the community, for the dollars that pour in through heritage tourism. But it also, feels the pressure to balance that with the the need to develop and expand and to meet the needs of, not only the folks who live there, but the millions of people who visit Gettysburg each year. So there is a tension there. I do want to highlight, a couple preservation projects that our organization has led over the past 5 years in Gettysburg that have really tried to strike that balance in terms of preserving both key portions of the battlefield while also being sensitive to community needs. So the first one I have here is the Mary Thompson House. Now, the Mary Thompson House is located on Seminary Ridge, and not only did this property play a pivotal role in the first day of the battle, it was essentially the site of the last Union resistance to fall northwest of town, but it also served as the site of General Robert E. Lee's headquarters for the remainder of the battle in the house and around the property. And the house, which was occupied by the widow Mary Thompson at the time of the battle, interestingly enough, was actually owned by the radical Republican congressman and staunch advocate of abolition, Thaddeus Stevens. So a lot of layers of history at this property. The trust acquired the property in 2014, and at the time it was contained an operating hotel and restaurant, along with the historic Thompson House structure. And there was certainly some community concern about the potential for a loss of jobs or tax revenue from our acquisition and from our planned restoration of the property. What we really tried to do then over the next 18 months was to work closely with the community and community leaders in good faith to have a dialogue and to work, to assuage any concerns they might have. And, a lot of that played out through the federal, state, and local review processes. Our restoration of the site went through a federal Section 106 review, state concurrence, and an archaeological review, and perhaps, most importantly for this discussion, a local review as well. The project was located within the borough of Gettysburg, right on the dividing line between the borough and Cumberland Township. And so we went through the borough's historic architecture review board process and the borough council's approval process. And, as a result of that, in addition to guaranteeing, certain treatments of the property during the restoration process, we also agreed to a one-time, payment to help offset any potential loss in tax revenue. And of course, we're committed to paying all applicable taxes until a potential future transfer to the Park Service. And, at the end of the day, that community dialogue and the review processes, really resulted in a win-win, in that the property was preserved and, restored. And as you can see from a couple of pictures, I hope this works. This was the property when we acquired it. And then this was a scene from when we opened the site in the fall of 2016. So you can see just from the broad number of folks in that photo, the restoration process in this project really became something that developed a broad base of community support, especially in that it helped to open up and really beautify that main western gateway into Gettysburg along Route 30. And I do want to highlight another project that's actually in the same area adjacent to the Mary Thompson House. And that's a project we did a couple years ago with the United Lutheran Seminary at Gettysburg. This was a project where we preserved 18 acres along Seminary Ridge, acquiring about 10 acres in fee and protecting about another 7 or 8 via conservation easement. This is, land that sat on the Lutheran Seminary campus, and again is adjacent to the Mary Thompson House. Figured prominently in the first day's fighting on the battlefield. Iron Brigade troops were there, and the location and the size and the significance of this property made it one of our most expensive preservation victories at a price tag of $3.5 million. But this was a project that was really well received by the Gettysburg community. You know, we worked primarily with the Lutheran Theological Seminary on the project, and in doing so, you know, it helped to provide key support to the seminary at a critical time, you know, which is, and the seminary is really an institution in the Gettysburg community. It was established in 1826, and it's Gettysburg's oldest educational institution. So this was a benefit to the seminary as well. And you know, the project also notably had no negative tax implications. The seminary being tax exempt, there's no loss of tax revenue from that perspective to either the borough or Cumberland Township. And just like the Mary Thompson House project, it really helped to preserve and to permanently protect that northwestern gateway into Gettysburg. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mark to talk a little bit about two other case studies in Orange County, Virginia, and Franklin, Tennessee.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, you know, so putting some of the slides together for this project was really a trip down memory lane. My grandfather, who was a career Navy man who grew up in landlocked Colorado, often talked about learning to swim in the deep end of the pool upon the beginning of his naval journey. And the map that you see before you represents my first project upon starting at the trust, actually 10 years ago this month, which arriving at the trust being told that the world's largest retailer would like to build a super center on what historian James McPherson calls the nerve center of the Union Army at the Battle of the Wilderness, right atop that site. And we would really prefer that they not do that, suffice it to say. So yeah, so as you can see before you, this was right in the literal wilderness with a capital W in central Virginia in Orange County. And Adam, if you could go to the next slide, please. So the wilderness is most well known for being the battle itself was inconclusive, but it was where General Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant faced off for the first time in combat. And it was also particularly notable for the fact that even though the battle was inconclusive, you had Union troops who had become so used to, after the outcome of a battle like the Wilderness, heading back up towards Washington. And instead, it was at the Wilderness Crossroads where General Grant gave the order to the Union troops on to Richmond, and was actually met with a great cheer right there at during the Overland campaign, and you know, that would ultimately hasten the end of the war. So the Wilderness, suffice to say, very historic for a number of reasons. And as I noted, you had the world's largest retailer wanting to put in a 138,000 square foot supercenter, and it was you know, even though you had an entity like Walmart involved, there were a lot of voices on the preservation side, and it brought together a great number of parties. You had, and literally talking about the political party, the Democratic governor of Virginia weigh in support of preservation there. You had the Republican Speaker of the House of Virginia, all the way to federal officials. You had a Texas congressman and Ted Poe, Vermont's Congressman Peter Welch, both Texans and Vermonters being heavily involved at the Wilderness, coming out and speaking out in favor of preservation here. And then mentioning Vermont, inclusive of literally the entire Vermont legislature weighing in on this preservation project, you know, far to the south. But it was still, it was quite a, you know, I'm sure that many on this call will well recall a lot of the news stories that came out during that time. And so over the course of 3 years, because this is much like what Adam had conveyed about Gettysburg, you have the same issue in a number of different battlefield communities where there are areas, landscapes of immense local, state, and national importance. But at the same time, you have local officials, trying to balance the needs of residents and visitors to the community, and having economic growth, and having stores available like Walmart. So at the trust, and we were certainly not alone among nonprofits either. The National Trust for Historic Preservation was front and center. National Parks Conservation Association, the Friends of Wilderness Battlefield, and a number of very intrepid local residents and local citizens who actually brought a legal suit against Walmart to halt the construction. And then Arnold and Porter LLP, providing, particularly Bob Rosenbaum from Arnold and Porter, providing just absolutely invaluable pro bono legal assistance throughout this effort. So you had a legal effort in combination with a grassroots effort aimed at convincing Walmart with facts like the founder of Walmart, Sam Walton, was himself an American veteran, and conveying the idea that surely Sam Walton would have been remiss to have seen one of his family's stores going in on a site like this. So with the combination of legal and grassroots advocacy, Walmart ultimately decided, and I can well recall the quote from Walmart's representative, that moving the construction of the supercenter away from the battlefield, they ultimately decided was the right thing to do. And so we immediately pivoted to thanking Walmart for being open to these, for being open to moving, and open to helping ensure a balance, that the Orange County community would still receive the benefit that had been sought by Orange County leaders to put the Walmart there in the county, while at the same time helping to make sure that the battlefield that attracts tourists from not simply Virginia but from around the country and around the world to go to Orange County, that those historic resources remain fully intact with their integrity. And and I would note, so you can imagine that after an effort like that, there had been some thought that the trust would once we achieved our aims, we would pull up stakes and leave the community. And that's precisely, going to the root of what today's conversation is about. Precisely what we did not want to do. We wanted to demonstrate that we are a long-term partner, interested in helping the Orange County community balance these necessities, and so embarked on a multi-year. And this was after the entire Wilderness Walmart discussion. Embarked on what became a multi-year cooperative effort that we called the Wilderness Gateway Study, that where we worked with local officials. We had the local board of supervisors involved, planning commissioners. We brought in numerous professional consultants, folks that could address transportation, economic development, cultural resources, and really sat down with the county and showed, really wanted to demonstrate our earnestness, and not simply wanting to achieve, a news-making victory and then leave, but in fact show how growth, economic growth, and preservation can really work hand in hand. And the quote that we have here on the slide is really indicative of the not simply détente, but the actual positive relationship we were able to build with Orange County after what had been, really just a multi-year effort where you literally had Orange County and groups like the Trust sitting on opposite sides of a courtroom and helping to bridge that divide. And Supervisor Goodman's quote there speaks to the success of that effort. And then Adam, next slide, please. So a little bit differently, in Franklin, Tennessee, which is really kind of just a stone's throw from Nashville, Tennessee, you had a little bit of a different situation there. And Adam, if we could go to the next slide, I will talk about it here momentarily. So at the dawn of the new millennium, the Franklin battlefield, which was a key Western battlefield in 1864, had been really all but lost. You had all sorts of modern buildings, modern construction that had you can really think of it as akin to the slide that Adam showed earlier on about with Chantilly. You had residences, you had restaurants, you had really anything you could think of. But you had also a community that that was very interested in doing what it could to preserve what was left of the battlefield, and maybe even a little more. And that was in the early 2000s. And Jim Lighthizer, who was president of the trust then and remains president today, we'll talk often about going to Franklin in the early 2000s and talking to the local folks there in the community, and really underscoring a point that we underscore often, which is that the trust, those of us at the trust based out of DC, can and certainly do weigh in with regularity with local leaders and communities, but the word of a preservationist in Washington, D.C., compared to the word of a local supervisor or local alderman's own constituent, there's zero question as to whose word really has more of an impact with local leaders. And I think being inspired by this and by Jim's reminder of this, the local community did precisely what Jim recommended in pulling together in 2004 under the aegis of something called Franklin's Charge, which brought together not only history-minded folks, kind of fringe groups and others that you would imagine, but local business folks, local public officials, the people who were interested and very much aware of the benefits that could redound to the Franklin community by pursuing preservation of the battlefield that they had there. But because of the growth and the development that had occurred, it was going to be certainly no easy road to hoe, and was going to be kind of an acre by acre, tract by tract grinding effort. But the acquisition the following year in 2005 of the eastern flank of the battlefield, which had been a golf course used by a local country club, that community leaders were really able to, working with the trust and other partners, able to generate a lot of enthusiasm to preserve and reclaim, really proved to be the spark for a much larger flame. And since that time, that flame has not been extinguished. Collaboration between the trust and Franklin's Charge and the myriad of preservation-based groups now in Franklin continues apace. We've been able to preserve, nearly 200 acres of hallowed ground there, and like I said, it was, these were sites home to, really everything you can imagine: car washes, gymnasiums. All sorts of different things that have been, much like in some of the photos seen earlier, have had that modern development taken down, with the actual battlefield landscapes now replacing them. And just definitely wanted to throw that, knowing that we had a number of Park Service officials on today, thought everybody would get a kick out of what I call here our president with former Chief Historian Emeritus Ed Bars from the Park Service looking on, taking what I call a hands-on approach, a decidedly hands-on approach here, taking down what was a pizzeria that sat atop the Franklin battlefield. And we'll not name names, but suffice to say there are multiple national brands of pizzerias we have successfully taken down two different brands there at Franklin. So I always joke that the third brand, it will hopefully locate any stores that they have decidedly off the battlefield moving forward. But we'll note that ABPP has recognized Franklin and the effort that really is rooted in that community partnership with state and national leaders. The largest battlefield reclamation now in North American history. So certainly a feat that everybody in the Franklin community should be and is very much proud of. And then quickly here too, before throwing it back to Adam, wanted to note Adam had mentioned earlier, and then I have alluded to the benefits that it really come to these communities that pursue preservation, that steward their battlefields from heritage tourism. And at the Trust, we have tried to quantify that over the years to make it easier for local public officials and communities to actually, things like tourism can often feel so nebulous. You can imagine like a big cloud, and it's hard to pin down. And we have tried to do that, to give it a little more substance over the years in a couple different reports. So the one that you see right here in front of you is our blue, gray, and green report, which came out in the early 2010s, really right in the midst of the Civil War sesquicentennial, the 150th, where and you can see on the slide here, we were able to quantify a number of different measurements of how how much funding comes back to community coffers, how businesses benefit from having heritage tourists, and you can see it is not insubstantial. You look at the bottom point there, where we discovered that a typical traveling family of 4 spends about $1,000 during a battlefield visit. And you can imagine that a lot of these battlefield communities that are typically more rural, those dollars carry even more of an impact in those communities than they do in some larger cities. Similarly here with the blue, gray, and green report, as you might have divined from its name, really homed in on Civil War sites specifically. So in the later 2010s, we were happy to be able to release the Battlefields Mean Business report, where we expanded the scope of really looking at battlefield economic impacts to include not just Civil War sites, but everything from Revolutionary War sites, War of 1812 sites. The report goes all the way up. We included even Pearl Harbor and the Hawaii World War II site in there as well, to just underscore the fact that Little Bighorn as well, just underscoring the fact that it's not limited to any one conflict, that these battlefield sites really carry economic benefits across historical eras, and then look at the report zeroes in on some focal battlefield parks that help tell that story, with some helpful anecdotes and different things from park superintendents and others in there, with that wider scope. And then wanted to be able to zero in here quickly today on what is just an excellent case study quickly telling the story of heritage tourism impacts. Virginia, which of course has the greatest concentration of Civil War battlefields, pursuant to the CWSAC report. So certainly has long had an interest in stewarding the sites in its care. These numbers are quite compelling, and so if you have a community where even if local leaders in a community might not necessarily themselves be historically inclined, just looking at the bottom lines show that history is profitable. Suffice it to say, you have the Virginia Tourism Corporation finding that your typical traveler to Virginia spends a little over $500 per trip, whereas your typical heritage traveler, folks that come to Virginia explicitly to explore its battlefields and other historic sites, spend nearly 2 times that amount on average, and also stay longer, And then you can see there at the bottom the kind of the macro numbers and just how impressive they are, with the Preservation Virginia and the folks at Virginia Commonwealth University having quantified that in a certainly a very impactful way.
Well, thanks, Mark. And we
Yeah,
just got,
thank you for letting me throw quite a bit out there, and would happily hand it back to Adam, who will cover. We've just talked about the economic benefits from battlefields to communities. Adam will delve a bit into some supplementary benefits, including, as you see here, on the environmental side.
yeah, thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. Just real quickly, want to run through, some environmental benefits of battlefield preservation in communities, and close it out here so we can get to questions any folks might have. I just wanted to note, battlefield preservation, in addition to the economic heritage tourism benefits that accrue to the communities, the environmental benefits are pretty wide-ranging as well. Conservation easements, which are one of our key preservation tools, are legally binding agreements that require private land to be maintained in an environmentally sustainable way, and that helps to protect water quality and open space and wildlife habitats. And each time that we place a conservation easement on a property, it ensures that the land is going to remain as open space and as a historic battlefield landscape forever. Would also note that obviously healthy watersheds are essential for drinking water, for the folks who live in these communities, and for wildlife. By way of example, the Chesapeake Bay watershed is home to 113 Civil War battlefields, 9 battlefields from the War of 1812, and 4 Revolutionary War battlefields. And to date, we've preserved a little over 27,000 acres in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And that includes more than 1 million linear feet of streams and rivers. Also, as much as possible, when we preserve battlefields, we aim to support the ecosystems that thrive there. Another example of this would be at the Breakthrough, which is part of the Petersburg battlefield in Petersburg, Virginia. We've planted native grasses, removed invasive species, and established vegetative buffers around wetlands, which helps to create a nurturing habitat for the wildlife that are there, which includes a couple endangered species in the region. And certainly, many battlefields took place, on or near farmland. And so preserving these fields, battlefield preservation, plays a role in keeping those places in agricultural use. And we'll close with this sort of as our last slide. Preserved battlefields provide a place where everybody can come together, to better understand our nation's history, and that's more important than ever. Battlefield parks have an even greater impact in both rural and urban communities where accessible public spaces are limited. They're also a great place to just enjoy being outside and take advantage of recreational opportunities, which has obvious physical and mental health benefits. And perhaps the most important benefit, in a lot of ways, of battlefield preservation is that it can teach current and future generations about the value of land conservation and historic preservation. By preserving these battlefields, you help to build a legacy of stewardship of both history and of nature, that can really have a lasting and real impact on the mindset of current and future generations. And with that, I think we got a few minutes, so we want to be sure to take any questions that folks might have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Adam, Paul, and Mark. Awesome presentation. Yeah, we've got a bunch of questions coming in here. First one, really timely and important. Says, thank you for this informative presentation. In light of recent current events, are conversations occurring about how to preserve these historical sites while honoring all groups involved, and how to encourage people to view these sites as a safe space resource to learn about history and culture?
Yeah, this is Mark. Now I'd be happy to take that. That is really that the question itself. I think really encapsulates the Trust's own approach to these sites and how we view them. Adam mentioned earlier that we see them as outdoor classrooms and places to remember and reflect as opposed to revere. So we very much believe in the idea that these are places where these battlefields are places where, as Adam noted, Americans of all backgrounds can come together to consider the conflicts that have really, on whose grounds our own history is immovably rooted, from the Revolutionary War that helped obviously initiate the establishment of what would ultimately become transformed from these United States into, after the Civil War, the United States. And I think our far and away our mission and our goal is to preserve the lands. We had mentioned this, or at least alluded to this earlier, in that we really view ourselves as a land preservation organization as opposed to a land management organization. And our goal is often, we know that there's always more endangered battlefield land out there that is threatened imminently by development. So our goal is to help save these spaces and then work with the Park Service and others to ensure that a long-term steward who can help ensure precisely the kinds of remembrances, reflections, conversations, again, that were encapsulated in that question, that those are able to take place at these hallowed spaces, and better help Americans understand and grapple with some of the more heroic and some of the darker chapters of our history.
That's great. And here's real quick a related question while we're on this topic. The Civil War was a war in major part about slavery, yet almost every picture and every person mentioned is white. How can this work more effectively engage a more diverse and particularly more African American communities?
Sure, no, that's a great question. I will note that our battlefield preservation efforts, have covered in a lot of different instances the preservation of USCT battlefields from the United States Colored Troops. We have worked particularly across the country, but recently on a couple really great projects in Virginia at the preservation of the Newmarket Heights battlefield outside of Richmond, where you had 14 USCTs were awarded the Medal of Honor for their actions there. We have also worked with the administration in Virginia on the addition of more USCT battlefields into their Conserve Virginia land conservation tool. We also try to make sure that we're actively, telling diverse stories to a diverse audience that makes up America, whether it's through our educational programs like our Head Tilting History newsletter, which will highlight, stories from minority history or from women's history, to videos that will tell those stories. We visited the Newmarket Heights battlefield this past fall with Lieutenant General Ron Coleman, who was the second African American to achieve the 3-star rank in the Marines, and had him reflect on the legacy of the African American soldiers who had come before him. So that we really do make a concerted effort to make sure that we are trying to tell those stories. We can always get better at it, but it definitely is something that we're placing a real emphasis on. And I'm not sure if Mark or Paul, either of you want to jump in on this.
No, I think Adam really summed it up nicely, and that the only thing I would add is that the video that Adam mentioned with Lieutenant General Coleman is I would encourage. It is an incredibly powerful video, and if folks have not had a chance to see it, we it's certainly available on our social media pages, on our YouTube page. And then would also mention too we have that's a part of our Warrior Legacy project. We also have some excellent videos, our Brothers in Valor series that help tell the story also with modern day military members, Medal of Honor recipients, who tell the story of a Medal of Honor recipient from a historical conflict and circumstances, who received the medal in circumstances somewhat parallel to their own, and it's just another really powerful storytelling tool that we have, and would again encourage folks, if you haven't gotten a chance, it's easily enough found on our website at battlefields.org, either searching for Warrior Legacy or Brothers in Valor.
And Mark, well, actually, one other quick thing I'll jump into on this front. One of the things we're partnering with the Park Service on is what we're calling the Great Task Youth Leadership Program, which focuses on bringing at-risk youth from cities, particularly Baltimore and Chicago, to Gettysburg to try to get younger generations out on these battlefields, to make sure that folks have access to this history. And that's something we're really excited about partnering with the Park Service on, and making sure that folks from all communities have access to these places.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mark, Paul, Adam. We had some other questions here, but folks, you've got the contact information there for the three gentlemen there. Thank you so much, guys. Awesome presentation, great questions, and a really interesting timing for thinking about historic battlefield preservation and within the last month, even really. A lot happening. Missed to mention that there's a lot of movement with making funding for LWCF, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, permanent. That could happen and passed the Senate earlier today. There's movement on that, so that could have bearings on this effort, and more broadly. So yeah, just thanks again, Mark, Paul, and Adam, and folks. I did put the contact information there in the chat box for our next webinar on July 1 at 3 o'clock. It's titled Planning for Successful Communities and Landscape Conservation at the Future West. A couple of guys from Future West will be presenting. They do a lot of sustainable community planning for communities in the Rocky Mountain West, and do excellent work. So you can register for that webinar in the chat box, or by, again, going to the Network for Landscape Conservation website. So thank you again, Mark, Paul, and Adam. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you for having us.
Great. All right, folks, have a great rest of your week. Take care.